Well, good morning, everyone. We're back here with Ask the Agronomist again from another remote location this week. I'm coming to you from the heart of Chris Callow's territory, actually, in Springfield, Illinois. We're all here at a team meeting, which is awesome that we're able to get back out and start doing a few meetings under modified restrictions. And so I've got about half of our sales team here with us today that may contribute a little bit from the live studio audience here. We've got a few questions that have come in over the last couple of weeks and things that I've been observing in fields. So we'll touch on that. And also, as always, love to have your live questions. Chat them in. If you can sign into YouTube, if you have a YouTube account, or if you do not, if you just have a Gmail account, whatever way you can get signed into YouTube, you can live chat those questions in. If your FSR happens to be here in the room, you can text them a question and they can chat those in. We've got producer Adam here as usual, and Adam and I will jump into things here in a moment. So thanks again for joining us on Ask the Agronomist. We do this every other week. We are exploring ideas of better times when we might do this. So if you have any thoughts on better time of day than 7:30 in the morning, we usually go for about an hour. We've thought about right after lunch. We've thought about like a happy hour later in the day. I'm very flexible. So whatever day makes it easier for you, or whatever time of day makes it easier for you to participate, we are thinking about experimenting with some different times. And if we end up moving to a different time, we'll make sure and let you know. So I will kind of kick things off just here with a little recap of what we're seeing out in the field. Obviously, we got rain and storms coming through the area again today, which are really unnecessary with the amount of moisture that we've had really over the past, well, really most of the growing season. We've been on the surplus side of moisture. We did have areas of the territory that were really dry early in the spring, and those areas that were borderline, damagingly dry early, that turned out to be a good thing for those areas, because the surplus rain that came later, if you had a dry subsoil, you had a little better capacity to hold some of that excess moisture. But we're really to the point now where nowhere in central Illinois does anyone not have a fully recharged subsoil. The subsoil moisture is clear to the surface in some cases. A lot of fields you drive by, there's ponds, you can see water between the rows, and it's really discouraging to see how much potential that we've lost due to excess moisture. It's especially sad when you consider all the places in the country that are still begging for rain. And I sure wish we could share some of our extra with them. Would have been better for everybody if we could have kind of redistributed the moisture. But we'll get through that. We'll probably spend some time talking about the impact that's having on crops here today. And if you have any questions, again, please chat them in. So, Adam, we'll kick it over to you. What's first on the menu?
Yeah. So this morning, I think where I'd like to start off chatting until we get some questions, and anybody coming in with any questions, again, please let your rep know. You can text them. You can do a lot of different things to communicate any questions. We like to chat, but there's been plenty of conversation. We've had the hail, some very bad hail in different parts of the area.
Yep, sure have.
And I know that's a hot topic, so I'm just going to start out there. Let's talk about corn first.
Right.
If we've got some hail damage on corn, how impactful is that due to where we're at with the growth and development process in corn? And what are some things that we should or shouldn't consider given the degree of damaging hail impacts we've had?
Yeah, so unfortunately, my territory has been impacted by two of the worst hail events that I've seen in my career. One about a month ago that we've talked about on two previous Ask the Agronomist, and fair amount of replanting occurred in that area. That was in southern Knox and northern Fulton County. And then here more recently in Hancock County, we had another severe hail event. The outcome of those two storms was quite a bit different because of the stage of growth of the crop was different in each case. So the most recent hail event in Hancock County on tasseled corn, if you look at a defoliation chart, which is kind of the first thing we go to when we're trying to assess what the impact of a hailstorm is going to be. If you look at a defoliation chart on corn, the most yield damaging time to defoliate corn is at tassel. Reason for that is that crop has done nothing to fill that ear yet. So it is just getting ready to go into the most stressful peak time of its life. And it has all of its leaves have already formed and emerged. So it has no capacity to grow new leaves at that point. And the factory that it was going to use to produce the grain has just been diminished significantly. So if you look at a defoliation chart on corn, you find VT for vegetative growth stage tasseling, and you go over to whatever percent defoliation you feel you're at. It is sometimes easy to overestimate the amount of defoliation because a leaf that has been battered and stripped and is hanging in tatters is still a leaf. It is still green. It can still capture sunlight. Now, it's not going to capture sunlight as efficiently as if it was hanging out there like it's supposed to be. But any green tissue on that plant, leaf sheath, even the rind of the stalk, but primarily the leaves, can photosynthesize, can produce food and nutrients to feed and try to sustain that plant. So, if that leaf area is still there in some shape or form, it will still contribute to yield. But if you look at corn that's been 70 or 80% defoliated, which I've been in some fields that I would say probably reached that level, you're talking 60% or better yield reduction based on defoliation. And then if you've had your lot of tassels knocked out, you could be worried about pollination. Now, honestly, I'm not as worried about pollination because two reasons. You can destroy a lot of tassels and still have plenty of pollen to get the job done. And frankly, if you've got a plant that can only support a third to half an ear, even if it doesn't pollinate perfectly well, you're probably still going to end up with more kernels on that ear than that plant's able to sustain anyway. So if those fields do pollinate clear out to the tip, they're just going to abort a tremendous amount of kernels because they're not really going to be able to feed and fill all those kernels. So corn is more impacted than soybeans. Now, driving by, the soybean fields almost look more alarming than cornfields because there's no leaves left on the soybeans and they're just sticks and petioles and branches and stems sticking up out in the field. And they just really look really, really sad, as does the corn. But, the corn's still standing there. The beans almost kind of disappear because if you strip all the leaves off of a soybean plant, there's just not much left there to see. So just like corn is a little bit surprising to the bad side, soybeans are actually surprising to the good side in that if you look at an R2 soybean, which is probably the growth stage that a lot of these early planted soybeans were in, if you strip 80, 90, even 100% of the leaves off of a R2 soybean plant, you're talking about a 15-ish% yield hit, which that's hard for people to believe that it's not worse than that when you look at the field. Now, it could be worse than that for a couple different reasons. If you'd gone out there and clipped all those leaves off with a pair of scissors and done no damage to the stem, no damage to the nodes, no damage to the petioles, no damage to the rest of the plant, I really think that's probably all the yield loss you would suffer. However, in a hailstorm, especially if you have bigger hail, you've got broken branches, you've got broken stems, you've got broken nodes, you've kind of battered that plant. So in addition to the defoliation, there's some other physical damage that occurs that I think is probably going to contribute to the yield loss. But soybeans are hurt far less than corn, primarily because they've got a lot of vegetative growth left ahead of them. Those soybeans are going to get new leaves out. They're going to get more branches out. They're going to get more flowers out. They're really just, they've got probably more than half of their growing left to do. And so they've got more potential to recover because they've got more potential to continue to grow versus corn, which is fully developed. So that's kind of the way I would assess damage. I'd look at the percent defoliation. I'd look at the other physical injury on the plant, and try to factor in as much as you can. If there's some green snap in corn, in addition to the defoliation, need to factor that in as well when you're trying to assess what the yield potential is. When it comes to fungicide, this is kind of a heated topic. I do think that there are lots of good opportunities to do some tests, do some trials. As an agronomy guy, I love to compare things. So great opportunity to go out in some of these damaged fields and spray half the field crossways, spray a couple rounds diagonally across the field, see what kind of response we have. In my opinion, the worst of the worst cornfields probably are not worth investing in a fungicide at this point to me, because not that the fungicide wouldn't help that plant, but if you've got a plant that's lost 60% or more of its yield potential, can you really add enough extra bushels to offset the cost of making that application? That's what I'm not so sure about. Now, on the on the fringes of the storm, where you've got corn plants that were defoliated 20, 30, 40%, let's say, kind of tattered and wounded, but not completely destroyed, I think that would be a good field to be investing in a fungicide in to protect the remaining leaf area that plant has. On soybeans, I do think I'm going to stay the course with my R3 fungicide on a lot of these hailed-on soybean fields, assuming that we've got new growth that comes out. I wouldn't rush out there and spray them now. It's a little bit early anyway. We need to wait, let them recover, let them get some new growth out, let them get new leaves out, start to grow again. And when that soybean's in that R3 stage, which R3 can last quite a while sometimes, we'll probably spend some time talking about staging and when's the best time to put a fungicide on here this morning. But assuming that field is recovering and you walk out there and they're in the R3 stage and you're looking at that field and you're going, man, I can't believe how good this thing looks compared to right after the storm. These things really have come back. You're starting to feel a little more optimistic that the field's going to amount to something. I think a field like that, I would still invest in that R3 fungicide and insecticide application to protect those plants. I did have a dealer call me a couple days ago that's in this hail-affected area. I had noticed a lot of Japanese beetles had moved into some of these soybean fields, and they were going to actually make some applications to control Japanese beetles. His concern was there's enough insect pressure there that they may be feeding on those leaves as fast as they're growing. And, controlling those insects might give those soybean plants a better opportunity to recover. The problem with Japanese beetles is you really can't keep them out of the fields. So even if you do a good job controlling them, if 3 days later, new ones have moved back in, I don't know that you can keep them out without making sequential applications. But just be aware, if you do have heavy insect pressure, heavy Japanese beetle feeding, that is going to be an additional stress on those plants that are trying to get new leaves out and recover. Might be something to watch for.
Yeah, so just to carry on with the whole hail theme, luckily in our footprint, that's the minority.
Yes.
Fortunate for some,
Yeah,
but
right.
What's going to be our outlook for weed control? And obviously these beans have been stripped.
Right.
They're leafless, closing the canopy. What's our outlook on our weed control issues there with some of those?
Right. Yeah. So relative to the hailstorm, obviously when you lose your canopy late in the season, never a good thing for weed control. So weed control is going to suffer. We've got plenty of weed control issues that we could talk about that don't even have anything to do with hail. So I have a general concern that this will be the weediest crop we've had in many years for multiple reasons. Some of that's weather related, some of that's management related, some of it's just challenges of getting applications made, again, due to weather. But I think in general, by harvest, we might be looking at some of the weedier soybean fields that we've seen in several years. But the hailed-on fields are going to get messy. If you haven't been out in cornfields, morning glory pressure is intense this year, and there really are very few programs being used in corn that will give you season-long morning glory control in a year like this. So if you've had corn that was impacted by hail and you've already noticed that you've got more morning glories than you'd like to see, the amount of sunlight getting to the soil surface and the amount of moisture that we've had, that's going to just really release a lot of those weeds that would typically be suppressed by the shading effect of the crop canopy. And really from this time of the year on, really all of our weed control is coming from competition from the crop and shade in the canopy. We hopefully our herbicides kept the field clean up till this point. From here on, most of the weed control is actually coming from the shading effect of the crop, because regardless of how strong the residual product you used 2 months ago was, that product is gone at this point, and especially when you factor in the amount of moisture that we've had. So from here on out, really what we rely on is crop canopy. And if you've lost your crop canopy, you really don't have much to protect you there. So I would be prepared if you've got a crop in the field that, even if it's an extend field and all you can spray is Roundup from this point on out, we can still get a lot of weed control from a glyphosate application. Can't control water hemp in most cases, but, velvet leaf, giant ragweed, foxtail, morning glories, for example, basically, for the most part, anything other than water hemp, we can get pretty good activity out of a glyphosate application. So, if you've got a Liberty option, you might want to use that. If you don't, I'd still maybe consider a late glyphosate application. We want to stay on label with these applications, which can get challenging. We all know that dicamba has, cutoff dates and restrictions that keep us from applying it season long. Well, all herbicides have restrictions based on growth stage. So, might surprise you that, with the case of 2,4-D, like on an enlist bean, R2 would be the cutoff. R1, R2 is the cutoff on Liberty. R2 is the cutoff on glyphosate. So basically, these beans are really approaching the end of the labeled stage for all herbicides. So just be aware that there really is not any herbicide that's labeled to apply on soybeans after R2. So just be aware of that if you're considering, doing some late weed control.
Yeah, so we've had some pretty tough growing conditions in some ways this year. We've been ebbing and flowing. Some people have had a little dry spell, but generally speaking, wet. And a lot of our crops seem to be shorter this year.
Mm-hmm.
Corn and soybeans both.
Mm-hmm.
I would say more noticeably than anything is probably the soybeans.
Right.
There's some concern about that. We've already addressed the weed control issues a little bit, but are these soybeans not getting any taller for us? Is that really indicative of how well the crop is set up to yield? And should we be trying to push that soybean crop with some fungicide activity, maybe some foliar nutrient application and things like this? I mean, how much hope and potential should we put in these soybeans, or should we be really scared of the fact that they're a little stunted and sometimes yellowed due to the weather that we've been seeing this year?
Well, Adam, that is the perfect question for the standard agronomy answer of it depends. When you pack that much into a question, it really makes it easy for the agronomist to pull the it depends lever.
I got to pack it all in there because you'll cover it all.
Yeah.
Never give me a chance to unfold that onion if I don't, Lance.
Yeah. So I think I'd like to address the height issue first. So in the case of soybeans, we started out cool, we started out dry in some cases, then we got tremendously wet. And so when it's cool, we were suppressing vegetative growth. When it's dry, we were suppressing vegetative growth. And now that we've been in saturated soil conditions, we're once again suppressing vegetative growth. So in one way or another, either because it was too cool, too dry, or too wet, we've been suppressing vegetative growth really all growing season long. So that's the primary reason the soybeans are short.
And oftentimes during those cool and wet periods, there wasn't very much sunshine. Solar and photosynthesis capabilities were definitely reduced.
Right. So there, and to answer your question about yield, there really is no correlation between height and yield in soybeans. I've seen knee-high soybeans that make 80 bushel, and I've seen chest-high soybeans that make 40. So there really isn't a direct correlation between height and yield. Now, I am concerned that we are not going to achieve the kind of soybean yields this year that we have been accustomed to. Not so much because they're short necessarily, but because of the excess moisture, because of the ponding, because of the saturated soils. You may have heard someone say before that soybeans don't like wet feet. Corn really doesn't either. There really isn't a crop other than maybe rice that is okay with wet feet conditions. But soybeans have really suffered more from excess moisture than corn. So as you're driving past soybean fields and you've got those large areas that are stunted and yellow, and even if you don't have drowned out spots in a field, we've all got the places that almost drowned out. And in those areas, we've got poor root health. We've probably lost our nodules on those soybean plants. Nitrogen fixation is going to be an issue for those plants. The plant's being suffocated. The roots just can't breathe. They really can't take up nutrients. The plant's not growing. So that's a very stressful scenario for those soybean plants. And unfortunately, when we're harvesting this fall, that yield monitor is going to pick up all those areas that were yellow, and you're driving through, 80 bushel beans, and you dive off into an area and they drop to 40. You may want to think back to what that area looked like in June and July. And if that's where the pale green, yellowish, stunted looking soybeans were, they're not going to be able to fully recover. So your question about, is there anything we can do to help them? We can always do things to help crops. We can always do things that the crop would appreciate. My challenge, when I put my farmer hat on, is can I make money doing it? So we really don't need to do things, or I don't like to recommend things to growers that they can't get a positive ROI on. Are these soybeans deficient in nutrients? Do they have diseases going on? Are they under stress? Can fungicides and foliar fertilizers help all those situations? Absolutely. But if your crop is about to die because it's in a pond or it's in a very saturated wet soil condition, can you really help it enough to get enough bushels to offset the cost of that application? And in some cases, you probably can't. I'm going to fall back to my standard recommendation of I would rather make a good field better than try to rescue a bad field. And I think the better your field is, the more likely you are to get a response. I did make an application on my own farm about a week or 10 days ago, where we went out with a reduced rate of a strobe fungicide, some insecticide, and some foliar nutrition, just trying to kind of give soybeans a little bit of a pick-me-up at about R1, and then we'll come back at R3, maybe R3-ish, with my, Delaro application of leverage. So I'm going to come back with my full rate, good fungicide, good insecticide at that traditional R3 timing. So it was an additional application that I don't always make. My hope was that I could help those soybeans get a little more growth, have a little better health. But I'll be honest, my part of the country, has not been flooded as bad as some other areas. So my bad spots and fields were smaller. So I would say most of the fields that I made that application in, 80% of the field looked pretty good. And I think that's probably where I'll get the bigger benefit, is in the 80% of the field that looks pretty good. If 80% of your field looks pretty bad, I'm not sure the 20% that's good can respond enough to offset the money that you're spending on the 80% that's bad. So, we talk about not giving up on a crop. But at some point, if you're not going to make money doing something, you're just kind of throwing good money after bad. So I do think there are some fields that, due to hail, due to ponding, due to, drowned out spots, probably at this stage of the game, I would not be investing additional money in. Just take what you get, and hopefully the crop that you get, plus maybe the insurance payment that you might qualify for, will kind of keep you whole on that farm. But probably not, in every situation should we be investing in foliar feed and fungicides and other things.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of variability out there this year. I think there's a lot of potential still out there too, even though there is a lot of variability for our crops to yield pretty well. And a lot of that probably has to do with water management and how well the field is able to get rid of surface water, and obviously tiling and things like that.
This will be, I think we've got a question in the room here. I'll get you in a minute, Dan. This will be one of those years where having good natural drainage will pay better than having good soil. So if you've got a field that, regardless of soil type, that the water could get off of, we've obviously had plenty of moisture that drought stress is not going to be an issue. Those fields that tend to lay wet, that either need a better tile system or need a tile system, or you can't surface drain, and frankly, the amount of moisture that we've had nobody's got a tile system that was designed to handle what we've had. So there's even some well-tiled fields that are going to suffer due to saturated soils. The fields that are probably going to be the best this year are the fields that the water could just run off of. We're going to have erosion issues. We're going to have ditches. We're going to have other issues in those fields. But if the water could get away quick enough, we're still going to have some good crops. And, generally, when you've had enough moisture that you've damaged crops on those poorly drained fields, those well-drained fields sometimes are exceptionally good in those type of years. So, question, Dan?
So, got a question that came in. Got some field edges to spray with Roundup.
Yeah.
Just going to do some spot spraying for grass, cucumber, velvet leaf here and there.
Mm-hmm.
Beans are an R1. Is it beneficial enough to throw the fungicide in when you're doing that at R1? Will you still get the benefit out of your fungicide at R1 versus R3?
Okay, so the question, if not everybody could hear that, was you're going to be cleaning up some fields that are woolly at about the R1 growth stage, asking about the possibility of tank mixing the fungicide in with glyphosate at that growth stage. So the first thing I would say is we want to make sure that we've got a labeled tank mixture that we're considering there. Typically, you're not going to mix a Roundup application with a fungicide because your fungicide is going on at R3 and your Roundup label stops at R2. So typically those two things are not going to be in the tank together. In Dan's question scenario, we're spraying at R1, which is earlier than we would recommend the fungicide. Is there still a benefit to fungicide at R1? Absolutely. Is it as big a benefit as at R3? Absolutely not. So technically, I would say, that R1 fungicide application, might still have a benefit, might have enough of a benefit to pay for the application, since you're already there making the application anyway. But that R1 application does not take the place of the R3 application. In an ideal scenario, what I would do in that scenario is I'd probably use an economical fungicide, maybe a straight strobe at a half rate for that first application. And then I would come back, I'd rotate to a different mode of action or different product, and I'd use my full rate fungicide at that R3 timing. Maybe you could delay that R3 timing towards late R3 because you already put a reduced rate on at R1. I think there probably will be some producers that want to just make that fungicide application one time. I'm there already. It's a convenient time for me to do it. A lot of the things that we do because they're convenient aren't necessarily the best, but convenience is important to people. So sometimes we do things that aren't the best just because it's easy. And I'd say throwing that fungicide in at R1 would kind of be an example of it's not the best, but it is easy. And in an ideal scenario, I'd probably do, if you want to do that, I would come back again at R3 and a half, late R3, with a better fungicide application after making that early fungicide application. And then also be sure you're still on label with your herbicide, as we talked about earlier.
So let's expand on that just a little bit, Lance. As far as fungicides, we get this question a lot about the ideal timing of fungicides, and we've talked about it a little bit on Ask the Agronomist before. But let's try and understand or describe a bit better as to why we have those timings,
right,
as being our optimal opportunity to maximize the return on investment for a fungicide,
right,
in corn and soybeans.
So I'm going to try to draw a little picture here. I'll move the easel up a little closer. We're a little bit makeshift here today from the hotel, so we're looking for that R3 timing in soybeans. The window is technically R2 to R4. R2 would be flowers all over the whole plant, which that's probably the growth stage a lot of soybeans are in. R3, you're looking for a 3/8 of an inch long pod on one of the 4 uppermost nodes. So the way you count nodes on a soybean plant is you look for the first leaflet that's got an emerged leaf, They don't have to be fully grown, but if the leaflets are separated, you can count there's 3 leaflets there. You follow that petiole back to the main branch, and so there's node 1. You count down 1 more, node 2. You count down 1 more, node 3. Count down 1 more, node 4. So that would be the 4 uppermost nodes. And somewhere on those 4 uppermost nodes, you're looking for that 3/8 inch long pod. And if you can find a 3/8 inch long pod on one of those 4 uppermost nodes, that's R3. If you've got pods down here that are 3/4 of an inch or, however big they happen to be, those don't count because they're not in the 4 uppermost nodes. What sometimes happens, and we especially see this in early planted soybeans, these soybeans are still growing. So you come out here today, here's node 1. Well, 3 days later, there's another new node out here. And so now that's node 1. And so now this one doesn't count. So, the 4 uppermost nodes are going to keep growing up. And sometimes that plant is growing fast enough that it kind of appears as though they really never get to R3. They will, but sometimes they hang out in that late R2 phase for a long time. That's actually one of the reasons we see a yield benefit to early planted soybeans. They spend more time in R2, more time flowering, more time in that reproductive stage. And the R2 growth stage is the growth stage that actually gets longer, typically with early planted soybeans. So sometimes that R2 to R4 window is a pretty wide window. The bulk of the data would say that the sweet spot for fungicides in soybeans is R3, because you've still got a lot of flowers a lot of blooming yet to happen, a lot of pods to set, a lot of pods to fill. That's kind of we think the best timing between, when disease incidence occurs, protecting the plant through the most spray too early. You're leaving that plant vulnerable to disease pressure in the R4 or R5 stage when it's trying to fill pods. If you spray too late, you might get too much disease started by the time you make the application of the fungicide, and that plant's already been through a lot of the more stressful time in its life. So that R3 is kind of what we consider to be the sweet spot. In corn, the equivalent sweet spot would be from tassel emergence to green silk. So VT to R1. VT would be tassel emergence, R1 would be pollination, and from VT to R1 is kind of the sweet spot in corn. There are people that recommend, waiting later when you have low disease pressure in corn. I'm not a fan of that recommendation personally, because if you're looking for plant health benefits from your stribilium and fungicides, you want those products in that plant's life, in that plant during the most stressful time of its life. And that's going to be usually 2 weeks after pollination, when it's trying to fertilize and set and fill and keep all those kernels on the ear. And so if you wait till brown silk, that might be fine if we've got low disease pressure or we've got late diseases come in late, but you're kind of missing the sweet spot for the plant health benefits of the strobies. So that's why we target that VT to R1 application as kind of the sweet spot in corn.
Yeah, that's a big difference between an indeterminate plant like a soybean that has the capability to keep doing some vegetative and reproductive things longer throughout the season versus a corn plant that it's step by step, one step after the next, and there's no reverting back. So
right, yeah, and with corn, we generally if you wait to that VT stage, every leaf that corn plant's going to have is out, so you are treating all those leaves at that time. And you're actually getting the best coverage on the top third of the plant, which is the part of the plant that's going to contribute the most to yield. And so you want to have all those leaves out before you make that application, but you want the application on early enough that you're protecting that plant during the most important part of its life. And we also need to get, because we have two categories of fungicide. We have preventative, we have curative. We do not have the third category, and I think some people think that we do have this category that I call resurrective. We do not have those. So you cannot resurrect a plant that's already got disease infection. So the curative fungicides do not, heal a plant that's already been infected. The preventatives, need to be on earlier. The curatives can go on a little bit later. But if the disease lesion's already there, even a curative's not going to help you. So that's why we got to get those fungicides on before that disease gets too far gone, too far developed.
Been having a lot of conversations about fungicide, and one other thing I'd like you to address just a little bit, Lance, is kind of how do we dissect the fungicide? We have different modes of action within our fungicides that we have on the market, just like we have different modes of action as herbicides,
right?
Try to control weeds. Let's talk a little bit about the three components of a fungicide real quick, and why having those three components is important to be utilizing with a fungus and diseases, generally speaking, versus when you're talking weed control. We like to have multiple modes of action in weed control, and it's almost even more important to have multiple modes of action in fungicide.
Yeah. So basically, as the use of fungicides in row crops has developed over the years, we've gone from single mode of action products up to a lot of three-way stacked products. There's multiple modes of actions in fungicides, just like there are in herbicides. Historically, we had a lot of straight strobies or a lot of straight triazoles. Then we went to two-way mixtures of strobies and triazoles. As that market continues to develop, now we've got the SDHI mode of action that is getting incorporated into a lot of these three-way mixtures. And so really we're broadening the spectrum of diseases controlled, because each different product typically has different strengths and weaknesses on the diseases they control. They can impact the amount of residual control that you can get, but the main benefit's resistance management. And Adam, you're right. We spend a lot of time talking about resistance management with weeds. Well, fungi and insects and other things develop resistance to pesticides even faster than weeds do. So if we continue to use straight good fungicide products, and we've already seen this with frog eye resistance to the strobies, we're going to lose the efficacy of those different classes of fungicides. So rotating modes of action, using multiple modes of action, using full rates. I know I made a recommendation for a cut rate a while ago, and some of my colleagues on the fungicide side of the business would say, don't do that, make full rate application all the time. And, that gets into, what's better for economics isn't always better for resistance management. And, using, those three-way mixtures, we think is going to prolong the effectiveness of those different classes of fungicides.
Yeah, absolutely. Because a lot of these insects, a lot of these diseases, spores from a fungus, they can sporulate, they can move, and there can be multiple life cycles of these diseases in one growing season compared to a lot of our weed species, actually. So really important to have that conversation, in my opinion, with whoever you're working with on your fungicide, and making sure that you're targeting whatever your main diseases are with your fungicide. And also making sure that you're addressing that question of, am I using multiple modes of action?
And I would say too, to maybe help you feel a little better about, doing good resistance management. In the case of fungicides, if you've got 3 products in that fungicide, you're probably going to get better disease protection, better disease control, more plant health benefits. And so generally speaking, while you're doing the right thing from a stewardship standpoint, you're also increasing your odds of getting a positive yield response, and you're increasing your odds of getting a bigger yield response. So hopefully, while you're doing the right thing for resistance management, you're also doing the right thing for increasing your yield potential. So you're not necessarily just spending more money, because those three-way mixes are going to cost more. I'm a big believer in fungicides. You get what you pay for. And a $10 fungicide is not going to give you the same benefits as a $22 fungicide. You might like to hope so, but that's probably not realistic expectation.
So great conversation on fungicides, and a lot of questions. Obviously, this is a time of year where a lot of that's taking place. But we talked a lot about the weather, the environment we've had this year, and how that's affected our crop. How has it affected nutrient availability for our crop? I mean, obviously the big one that comes to mind is nitrogen. There's
Right.
obviously other nutrients that could be suffering from the ridiculous amount of load of water we've been having around here that's kind of flushing things down through the system.
Yep.
You know, do you think we have a good amount of nutrients left for this crop to finish out? Is there anything that we can do to help that? Are we mineralizing enough nutrients from the soil? You know, what's kind of your take on our current status, given all the moisture we've had, particularly I'd say with the corn crop, as to, are we going to run out of nitrogen?
Right. So, you know, at some point in that plant's lifetime, it generally is going to get into a nutrient deficient situation. It's hard to prevent that. At some point, if you do nitrogen rate studies in corn, the corn that stays green clear to the ground all the way through grain fill that never looked like it was deficient in nitrogen is not going to be the most profitable level of nitrogen. So at some point, as we're going through grain fill, some amount of firing, some amount of nitrogen deficiency in corn, you should actually be seeing that. If you're not, you're over applying nitrogen. Probably not the best thing to do from a stewardship standpoint, and you're probably also costing yourself money if you don't see some firing in corn at some point. Now, however, with the moisture conditions we're under, you know, we've had corn that's been fired, you know, all year long in some of the wet spots. We don't like to see that. You know, you asked the question of what has the impact to nutrients been. Any mobile nutrient in the soil is going to be getting washed out of the root zone. In the case of nitrogen, we can lose a lot through denitrification when we're ponded. That's typically the way we lose nitrogen in our good prairie soils, is through denitrification, which is losing as a gas off into the atmosphere. We can leach it to the tile lines and lose it that way as well. So we've undoubtedly lost nitrogen. We're also not in an ideal situation for mineralization of nitrogen when you've got a waterlogged saturated soil, because the soil microbial biomass, which is largely involved in that mineralization process, is not functioning as they should be in that anaerobic environment. So it's kind of a double whammy. We lose a lot of the nitrogen that was in a plant available form in the soil, and we can't release more nitrogen out of the soil to benefit that plant. A third way that crop is struggling is the roots really are not able to function when they're in a saturated environment. So even if there's nitrogen there, if that root system is completely waterlogged and there's no oxygen in the soil, that root system is not really going to be able to intercept and utilize those nutrients. So our less mobile nutrients in the soil, like potassium, phosphorus, and things, you know, they're still there, but the root system is not really functioning correctly in that saturated anaerobic environment. So the plant's not able to take in those nutrients. So it's not an ideal situation. We definitely have negatively impacted nutrient availability. Some of that through loss, some of it through root function. There isn't a whole heck of a lot you can do about it, in my opinion. You know, in the case of a macronutrient like nitrogen or potassium in corn, you can't get a lot of nutrient in foliarly. And those macronutrients that plant's needing pounds per day, you can't put pounds per day on foliarly. Are there situations where we would see a benefit from a foliar application? You know, there absolutely are. I can't always predict when those are going to occur, but you definitely can see benefits to foliar feeding crops. But we have limited potential of how many pounds of nutrient you can get into that plant through the leaves. You know, we're designed to take pounds up through the roots. And if the pounds aren't available or the roots aren't functioning, you know, we're not able to get it into the plant. Most of these really yellow areas and fields are yellow primarily due to suffocation and anaerobic soil conditions and lack of oxygen more than a nutrient deficiency. So if the soil environment would improve, those plants would be able to find more of what they need, and the color and appearance of that plant would improve. So the main issue is the wetness. You know, there are situations where we've got deficiencies, but the main issue is not a deficiency of nutrient. It's a deficiency of oxygen and an excess of moisture.
So, even though we got a lot of stressed plants out there, I get the question all the time, and I know you get it too. I mean, does our crop have good potential yet? And I feel like we've had a little bit of a, we've talked about a lot of the stresses that are going on.
Right. We have been kind of negative today.
Yeah. I want to kind of turn this around just a little bit here and say,
I got a room full of salesmen here that want somebody to want to buy something.
That's right. That's right. I mean, rain makes grain, Lance.
Yes.
Speaking.
Yes.
I mean, we're
at the top of the hill. That is always true.
Yeah. We're we're flirting with having just a little bit too much rain at this point in time. We don't need any more for quite a while.
Yeah.
But just give us your comments, generally speaking, on what you think the potential is of the crop.
I'm still very optimistic for the potential of a lot of corn that's on relatively well-drained soils. I am concerned about the beans, and I'm not concerned that all the beans are going to be horrible. But if you've been hitting farm averages of 80 plus, the last few years in soybeans, I think that's a little out of reach. We may be in a year where good beans are 65, not 90. In the corn, it's all going to depend on drainage. If you've got a well-drained field, I mean, there could be 300 bushel corn out there, but if that 300 bushel corn's also got 10 acres of zero, that field average is going to come down fairly quickly. So it's all going to relate to drainage in both crops. If you've got a field of beans that look good, that have managed to grow, that have good color, a lot of blooms, a lot of branches, I would be very optimistic about the potential of that crop. We've had moderate temperatures. We've had barely any days over 90 all year, which is always good for yield. Cool growing seasons tend to be high yield years. We've had ample moisture, which tends to support yield. We have been cloudy, so solar radiation has been reduced, and we could actually have some situations where that could be impacting yield in a negative way. I really think the saturated soil conditions is going to be the primary, negative driver on our yields. But, if your crop looks pretty good, I think your crop is good. If it looks pretty rough, I hope the good parts of the field kind of offset the rough parts of the field. But I certainly think there's fields that have very good yield potential. There's going to be a lot of variability. It seems like we say that every year. And we do, because there's variability every year. But there's going to be variability from field to field and tremendous amounts of variability within field. And, we're kind of used to that, but we might even see more of that than maybe normal.
Yeah. Just depending on that surface drainage, I think you mentioned that earlier. I think in corn anyways, that's going to be a big component as to how well your corn crop has set itself up to succeed.
Yeah.
So.
And soybeans as well. I was looking at a field, neighboring field of mine that they just put a bunch of tile in 2 years ago. And this field's fairly flat, but it's not a poorly drained soil naturally. It's got a good tile system in it, and this field's planted to April planted beans, and you can see every tile line in that field. And there's about a 20-foot wide green streak on top of every tile line. And then in between, every tile line, those soybeans get a little smaller, a little yellower, and then you get close to the next one, they get a little bigger and a little greener, and you get right over that next tile line, and they're beautiful again. Now that field, with the weather conditions we've had, the tile lines would have to be about 30 feet apart for the whole field to look good. And there aren't many systems out there that are only 30 feet apart. But, if you've got one of those, you're probably going to be happy that you do. And if you've got a tile that's, say, 100-foot spacings, you may be thinking about splitting that down to 50-foot spacings, watching what's going on in that field with the moisture that we've had.
Yeah. So one last thing I'd like to touch on here, and if anybody has any more questions, please get them into your rep, tweet them, put them in the chat on YouTube. A lot of different ways to get a hold of us, and we love to have good conversations about agronomic issues that are very specific to West Central Illinois, which is where we operate as a team. And one question that's been kind of coming up here and there is corn rootworm. Where are we at with corn rootworm? Do we see that little bugger making a resurgence? And where are we seeing that? Are we seeing it here in West Central Illinois? We've seen it in other parts of Illinois, other regions of the Corn Belt. Where are we at on corn rootworm?
Yeah, so So, some of you know Jim Donnelly, who's a colleague of Chris and I's. That's our counterpart in Northern Illinois, and Chris and Jim and I like to pick on each other agronomically from time to time. And one thing that Chris and I can pick on Jim for, unfortunately, is the amount of rootworm pressure that he has to deal with. Northern Illinois has historically had a lot more corn on corn. They've historically had heavier rootworm pressure. And then you combine that with the fact that Northern Illinois has been dry really most of the growing season. There, believe it or not, there's still places in Northern Illinois that are dry and would benefit from more moisture. Rootworms are far more damaging in dry weather than they are in wet weather for two reasons. Losing your roots is going to hurt you worse in a drought than when you've got ample moisture. And, rootworms, just like corn doesn't like wet feet, rootworms are not particularly good swimmers, and they can't hold their breath indefinitely either. So I think we've probably actually drowned some of our rootworms, and our pressure isn't as heavy as Northern Illinois. So I dug my first rootworm trial a week ago. This was in a field of 10th year corn in Warren County, and did not have heavy rootworm pressure, based on the root digs that I did in that field. I've seen some pictures from Northern Illinois where the entire root mass is smaller than my fist because all the rest of it has been consumed by rootworm larvae. And, that's a tough situation to be in. So I know Northern Illinois cannot get SmartStax Pro, which is the next generation of rootworm control, into the marketplace quick enough. And so they're looking forward to launching that technology next year. We're primarily rotated, here in the central part of the state, and we're really not seeing heavy rootworm pressure on our rotated acres. We have seen heavy pressure in some corn on corn situations, but it's not as consistently heavy as it is in other parts of the country. So I think the wetness that we've had this year might, be holding the rootworm back from coming back and maybe as quickly as we thought they were going to. We have noticed an uptick in pressure over the past few years, but this wet environment is not particularly conducive to rootworm populations either. So that could be unfortunately, if it's wet enough to drown rootworm, it's wet enough to reduce the yield of your crop as well. So it's not necessarily a great thing that we've been so wet that we've killed off rootworm, but we probably did drown some larvae in some fields this year.
How much of an overwintering effect with the weather do you think there is with corn rootworm?
I think it's minimal. And it depends on the species. Southern corn rootworm does not overwinter good in cold soils. That's why they're primarily the South. Northerns that go clear up into Minnesota, northern Iowa, the Dakotas, you really can't kill a northern corn rootworm with cold. Western corn rootworm are pretty tolerant to cold conditions as well. So I don't think we necessarily see a big impact on rootworm overwintering due to wintertime temperatures or the amount of snow cover that we get. The primary thing that favors rootworm development is, what are the environmental conditions during and after egg laying, and how wet or dry is it in May and June. So dry conditions in May and June really adds to the survival of larvae. And if you have good egg laying, good conditions for egg laying, and then good conditions for larval survival in May and June, and heavy pressure, those are years when you're going to have lots of issues from rootworm. And then if you add some drought stress on the crop on top of the heavy rootworm pressure, that's when you see those 80 and 100 bushel yield hits that we sometimes see from severe rootworm damage.
Yeah, I agree. I get that question a lot, though. Our winters seem to be varying greatly here the last few years, and everybody always speculates how much influence that does or doesn't have on the corn rootworm population around here.
Yeah, I think overwintering temperatures, in fact, impact other species of insects more than it does rootworm. I've seen some studies that rootworm has a pretty good ability to survive very, very well in deeply frozen soil. And the other thing to consider is, the temperature of frozen soil is typically around freezing. So when soil freezes, it might be 20 below outside, but that frozen soil is about 31 degrees. The frozen soil is not negative 20 like the air temperature is. So that rootworm really doesn't experience the, ambient air temperature that you and I are feeling, because once that soil freezes, it really doesn't get much colder than freezing.
Well, we're coming up here on about, what is it? We got about 5 minutes left.
Okay.
If anybody has any questions or comments, again, please get them in to your rep or to just about any of the social media outlets that are out there. We're on Twitter, we're on YouTube, we're on Facebook. So there's a lot of ways to have a good conversation with us and ask questions that are very, very specific to our region here in West Central Illinois. So we really invite you to please tell anybody and everybody that you like this type of content, these types of conversations. Share it. You can like it on YouTube. You can share it through YouTube. And by all means, if you don't have the time to watch it or have suggestions for different times to watch our live presentation of Ask the Agronomist, let us know. Get a hold of anybody that's involved with DeKalb and Asgrow, and we will try and take whatever feedback you guys have and adjust our schedule so that we can try and get as much live interaction as we can. A lot of people watch these Ask the Agronomist after the fact.
Right.
There's a lot of archived good information that
Right.
you can get back on YouTube and follow up or hear what we had to say about current events. But we like to have a conversation. So please get in touch with us any way you can.
And the main benefit to you as a viewer of asking questions is that prevents the agronomist from getting up on a soapbox and talking about something that he wants to talk about, which is what I'm going to do for the last couple minutes here, since we didn't get any more questions and Adam was begging for questions. So this is your fault for not asking questions. But I didn't bring my soapbox with me today. But if I did, I'd get up on it. Want to talk about soybean weed control a little bit. I mentioned earlier that I do think we're going to have some pretty weedy soybean fields out there. Some of that's due to we couldn't make timely applications because of weather delays. Some of it's due maybe to lack of growth of soybeans and not as good a canopy. If you've had hail, damage, you've lost canopy that way. Obviously, the excess moisture that we've had is not really beneficial for weed control. But I have a lot of people that, get frustrated with some of the restrictions in the dicamba system, like the June 20th cutoff date. And there's just this general feeling in the industry that, we need more time to get our work done. And I understand that time is precious, and I understand that days are sometimes limited. But just because you have the ability to try to control weeds in soybeans in July doesn't mean you should be. Ideally, we need to be targeting those 2 to 4 inch tall weeds, regardless of what herbicide system you use. And there are very few fields of soybeans planted in the state of Illinois in a normal growing season that should not have their post application made by June 20th, regardless of what system you're using. So I've seen a lot of fields that got sprayed since the 4th of July where we're spraying 12, 18, 24, waist high in some cases weeds. We really don't have technology today that will control 2 foot tall water hemp in soybeans. So we really need to try to focus those applications earlier in the season. I know it's a logistical challenge to get the work done. I know it's nice to have flexibility to make later applications. That's one big benefit of the XtendFlex system, that people have the ability to spray Liberty later in the system than you can spray dicamba. But, we really, are in a tough situation when we're trying to kill, knee high or bigger weeds with any of the systems that we have available today. So if you're frustrated with your weed control in soybeans at the end of the season, be a good time to sit down with your suppliers and talk about, well, what would work better next year? And I think in a lot of cases, what would work better next year are earlier post applications than what I saw people making this year in some cases. So, worst case scenario, if you go too early, which I'm not sure there is any such thing as too early, but if you do go too early and you get a late flush, we'll deal with that. But a late flush is a lot easier to deal with than a 2 foot tall weed that was an early flush that got sprayed late. So that is a much worse scenario to find yourself in than making another pass to control some small weeds that come up late. So I'll get off my soapbox there. Any more questions have come in while we were talking there, Adam. So no. So we'll be back again in 2 weeks. If you've got feedback on if you'd like to see this at a different time of day, obviously those of you who are here, this time of day works for you. And the people who aren't here didn't hear me say that. So, it's kind of hard to get feedback from people who aren't here. But those of you who joined, if you have a different time of day that you would like to see this at, if you've got questions, text them, email them, send them in, and we'll be with you again in 2 weeks. Everybody stay safe.